Your heart has been beating since before you were born, around 100,000 times a day, over 2 billion times in an average lifetime, without pause, without instruction, without you ever having to think about it. And then, one day, it stops. Death is the one thing every human being who has ever lived has in common. And yet, most of us have almost no idea what actually happens in the moments after it occurs. Not the philosophical question of what comes after, the biological one, the precise, measurable, second-by-second sequence of events that unfolds inside the human body in the first 60 seconds after the heart beats for the last time. It turns out those 60 seconds are far more active and far more fascinating than most people imagine. At the moment the heart stops, the body does not immediately know it has died. That sounds strange, but it is biologically accurate. The heart's job is to pump oxygenated blood to every cell in the body. But there is already oxygen present in the blood, in the tissues, in the cells themselves. That oxygen does not disappear at second zero. It begins to deplete. The brain, which consumes roughly 20% of the body's oxygen, despite being only 2% of its weight, is the first organ to feel that depletion. Within the first few seconds, the last electrical signals from the heart ripple outward through the body. The muscles that were tensed begin to relax. If the person was standing, they fall. If lying down, the last visible tension leaves the face and the hands. The body, for the first time in decades, is completely still. Between 5 and 15 seconds after the heart stops, the brain begins to lose consciousness. The brain requires a continuous supply of oxygen to maintain awareness. When blood flow stops, the oxygen already present in the brain's tissue lasts only a matter of seconds before neurons begin to lose their ability to fire. This is the biological mechanism behind fainting. When blood pressure drops suddenly, the brain loses oxygen briefly, and consciousness disappears. Death works on the same principle, just without recovery. Interestingly, some research suggests that in this brief window, the brain may produce a surge of activity. Studies on dying rats found a burst of highly synchronized gamma wave activity in the seconds after cardiac arrest, more organized in some ways than the brain activity recorded during normal waking life. Whether something similar happens in humans, and what, if anything, it might feel like, remains one of the most genuinely open questions in neuroscience. Between 15 and 40 seconds, something unexpected happens. The body begins to release. The sphincter muscles, which are held closed by active muscular contraction throughout life, relax. This is why the body often releases its bladder and bowels at or shortly after death. It is not a failure of the body. It is the body doing exactly what muscles do when they are no longer receiving signals to contract. The eyes, if open, begin to lose their characteristic sheen. The cornea, which requires a continuous supply of oxygen and nutrients from the blood, begins to cloud very slightly within minutes of circulation stopping. The skin, no longer receiving blood flow, begins to pale. In people with lighter skin tones, this is visible quite quickly. A subtle but noticeable shift in color as the blood retreats from the surface. Every one of these changes is the body, systematically powering down, not collapsing, not decaying, simply stopping. By 40 to 60 seconds, the process moves to the cellular level. And this is where the story gets genuinely surprising. Individual cells do not die the moment the heart stops. They continue to function, consuming the remaining oxygen and glucose available to them for minutes, and in some cases, hours after clinical death. This is why organ transplants are possible. A heart removed from a recently deceased donor can be kept viable for several hours under the right conditions. The cells of that heart are still alive. They simply need oxygen and nutrients delivered by different means. It is also why the definition of death has become increasingly complex in modern medicine. Brain death, cardiac death, and cellular death are three different events, and they do not always happen simultaneously or in the same order. At 60 seconds after the heart's last beat, the brain is unconscious, the muscles are relaxed, and the body is still. But at the cellular level, millions of tiny biological processes are still running, unaware in a sense that the organism they belong to has ended. There is something quietly profound about what those 60 seconds reveal. We tend to think of life and death as a switch, on or off, alive or not. But the biology tells a different story. Death is a process, not a moment. It unfolds in layers, at different speeds, in different systems, over different timescales. This understanding has transformed modern medicine. The concept of clinical death, the stopping of the heart, and breathing was once considered the final word. Today, medical teams routinely restart hearts that have been stopped for many minutes. Patients have been resuscitated after more than an hour of cardiac arrest in specific circumstances. The boundary between life and death, it turns out, is far more permeable than we assumed. And the more closely we look at what happens in those first 60 seconds, the more we realize that the body does not give up easily. It fights at the cellular level long after the conscious mind has gone quiet. The question we started with, what happens to your body in the first 60 seconds after you die, turns out to have an answer that is equal parts biology and philosophy. The heart stops. The brain loses power within seconds. The muscles release. The cells fight on. But perhaps the most surprising thing is this. Those 60 seconds are not the end of the body's story. They are the beginning of a transition, one that plays out over hours and days and eventually returns everything the body was made of back to the world it came from. Every atom in your body was forged in a star. Every molecule was borrowed from the soil, the water, the air. Death is simply the moment when the borrowing ends and the returning begins. We are, all of us, temporary arrangements of the universe, looking at itself for a little while and wondering what it is. Thanks for watching Quiet Atom. Subscribe and stay curious.